We have the lowest fertility rates in American history. We have the lowest marriage rates in American history. And ultimately, the 60s is about a frontal assault on the natural nuclear family and on faith and religion in the public square.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
And we are joined today by Tim Goeglein, who is the Vice President of External and Government Relations at Focus on the Family. And he was previously the Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. He's also the author of a number of books, including The Man in the Middle, about the Bush administration through the lens of faith and politics, American Restoration, Toward a More Perfect Union, which we've done a podcast episode on here at ISI, and now Stumbling Toward Utopia, How the 1960s Turned into a National Nightmare, and How We Can Revive the American Dream, which is the subject of our episode today. So Tim, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you. I love ISI, and I'm so pleased to be invited.
Great. Well, why don't you start by telling us more about this book and perhaps what inspired you to write it when you did?
Well, I was born in 1964, and I was speaking to a large group of students about 3 years ago. And one of the things I learned is that not just young people, but all of us tend not to know a lot about the years in which we were born. And with pinpoint accuracy, and I'm not overstating it, I travel about a third of the time in my role as Vice President of Focus on the Family. I do debates, panels, speeches, remarks, you name it. And I'm not a betting man, but if I were, with pinpoint accuracy, at almost every single gathering, whether it's a progressive audience, conservative audience, a mixture, sort of ideology, none of the above, etc., with pinpoint accuracy, almost somebody, when you get to the Q&A, will say something like, how in the world did we get into this mess? And, you know, in many other chapters of American life, if a speaker or debater had been asked that, he or she would be bound to say, you know, tell me more what you mean. But I think it's fair to say that in the era we are in, people know what we mean. Which is, how did we get to this cultural moment? Kind of inverted reality, things seem often upside down, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was flying back from this particular gathering. Once we were airborne, I was flying from Tulsa. I asked one of the stewards, I think that airplanes have the smallest napkins in world history. And I asked for a small stack of them, and I began to scratch out the outline to what became Stumbling Toward Utopia. To answer this question, how did we get into this mess? Better understanding it, what are we going to do about it? And frankly, the ability in a book like this to be able to share, what you have found, but above all, why you have found it. What does it all mean? And what are we going to do with that? And so in Stumbling Toward Utopia, I wanted to answer the question, where in the world did the moral and social revolution of the 1960s that gave us this mess, where did it come from, and what does it mean?
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Well, that's a great starting point, Tim. And I love the fact that you wrote it out on a set of napkins, kind of like the Laffer curve was also written on a napkin, that first concept. So I guess conservatives and napkins, there's this sort of natural affinity or a way for things to take off. But I'm interested in the subtitle, How the 1960s Turned into a National Nightmare. It maybe implies, and I wonder if you could speak to this, whether, in the beginning of the 1960s, it was not this way. It perhaps did not need to become this way. So maybe you could explain what happened, and if it wasn't from its beginning a disaster, how it transitioned from maybe something good or not just the normal parlance of American life to the national nightmare that you're describing.
I really love that question, Tom, because what I found is that if you really want to understand where the moral and social radicalism of the late 60s and 70s came from, what I found is you have to go back just a few years to the turn of the 20th century. And frankly, as I say in Stumbling Toward Utopia, what this relative handful of very powerful, influential people had in common and what they wanted to do. The thing they had in common is that they were sort of utopian. That's where I get the title from Sir Thomas More's great book, the perfectibility of man. This is what progressives ultimately have in common, that if you can just social engineer it, if you can just get the right set of variables, you will resolve the problems of the human condition. To use a few examples, as I do in the book, Woodrow Wilson comes to the presidency in 1912, former president of Princeton University, New Jersey governor, the ultimate progressive at the beginning of progressivism. And Wilson, is very uncomfortable with the U.S. Constitution. He's very uncomfortable with the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he writes comments and articles, and he was very eloquent, one of our most eloquent presidents ever. And he speaks about and writes about, the inadequacy, the outdatedness of the Constitution and the Declaration. He suggests that what we need in America is an America run by experts. Does that sound familiar? Kind of citizen sovereignty, that's yesterday's news. He really does believe that we ought to have kind of an American version of a prime minister. And guess who the prime minister is? Him. Then we have John Dewey, another early 20th century progressive. His obsession, unlike Wilson, is not politics and public policy, it's education. And his idea, that the idea of school is the development of great citizens. The idea of objective notions of reading, writing, arithmetic, science. Dewey's really not ultimately about that. What he's about is the new citizen and how we can social engineer the new citizen and how we can reimagine and rethink education, frankly, at every level. Very well funded by the Rockefellers, the pedigree of the University of Chicago and Columbia College behind him. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, a racialist, a eugenicist, one of the catalyzers of what became the leitmotif of the radicals of the 60s, the sexual revolution, the frontal assault on marriage, family, parenting, human life, religious liberty, conscience rights, parental rights, the gender debate and pronouns. It's amazing when you really study those early progressives who reimagine and want an America like the 60s. They're talking about these things. And finally, one of my favorites is Roger Baldwin, the founder of the ACLU, a very committed communist and somebody who's very uncomfortable with the idea of justice in the American experience. All of them are more comfortable with less religion, less faith. And of course, we're a religious republic. So the idea of where we've become and where the 60s brought us is very consonant with these very bad ideas.
So on the topic of social engineering and the new perspective of that age, starting at that, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson and Dewey and, some of these thinkers that were more at the advent of the 20th century itself. Can you talk more about the kind of individualism the 1960s introduced? Because Tocqueville said that the word was unknown to our ancestors because they thought of themselves in groups. But modernity brought this idea that people could exist in isolation from the group. So how does that fit into our idea as conservatives of the individual in a way that's different from the conception that, the modernists and the revolutionaries of the 1960s, both, domestically and abroad might have? Because I think we think of the 1960s as dovetailing with maybe some of these, and you mentioned Marxism, dovetailing with some of these radical Marxist attitudes. And I'm sure there was, like you mentioned, definitely an influence there. But how did they reconcile, and maybe they didn't, those different things that appear and sound so polar opposite, the the more, the communist, the commune attitude and the individual attitude?
I really love that question because you go back to a speech that will be a great speech 1,000 years from now, George Washington's farewell address. That it's about the country, it's about community, it's not about factionalization or ultimately the obsession of the individual. Now, Washington definitively is not against individual contribution to the idea of a United States, and I could go on and on in that regard. But this obsession, if I may say, and I think it really becomes that with moral relativism, with nihilism, with this idea that there's not an objective standard of right and wrong, good and evil. Marxists, echoes about this idea that it's really not about economics, it's about the remaking of human nature, the perfectibility of man, and the idea that you can sort of brush aside and conceptually change the idea of what it means to be a human being by the overlay of a very aggressive secularization of modernity. Now, there's no doubt there's a lot of Freud in this, there's a lot of Darwin, there's a lot of Marx, no doubt about it. But when we speak about the direct impact and where the 60s and 70s in the American experience came from, it's not to say that the Europeans did not strongly influence, as I say in Stumbling Toward Utopia, they most definitely did. But in the differentiation of where does the 60s and 70s in America come from, I really believe that it's important, and just as you say, that we re-examine these questions of a progressivism that seems to relish disharmony. It relishes disunity. And as you know, Marlo, in the book, I have a very large section on Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky and a large section on the Port Huron Statement. The Port Huron Statement is the blueprint of the New Left of the 1960s. They're going to remake and take over higher education, and then they're going to impose those ideas in the country, rooted in a radical individualism. You're absolutely right, about that. And of course, rules for radicals. I won't go through all the rules today. They're in the book. But Rule 13 is the one that I think is important. Saul Alinsky says, focus like a laser beam on creating your adversary. And then what does he say? Polarize. I was with a group of ISI people a few weeks ago, and I was leaving the gathering, and I have a very good progressive friend who I happened to see in the same conference center. And he said to me something that I've heard over and over, Marlo, across the last several years. Isn't it terrible, she said, how polarized we all are? And I said to her, I'm not sure what you mean, because almost all of the early progressives felt it was very important to polarize. If you want to remake the country, you have to create unbridgeable chasms. Somebody who disagrees with you is not, a friend who happens to have an opposing point of view. The person who opposes you is your enemy, is your adversary. This kind of individualization, which I think has unfortunately developed with incredibly predictable, serrated edges.
It's a really good insight, Tim, because the 60s, as I understand it, really did open up these sort of fissures by which we have become polarized. Even some would suggest we've become more divided than we were before the Civil War, along, the lines of race and sex and national identity, ideology, religion, family, the
Yes.
things that you're sort of describing. I'd be curious. I've read and enjoyed Christopher Caldwell's book on the 1960s, and
Yeah.
his impression, or at least my reading of it, is that the 1960s, though a calamity, was in some sense necessary. It was kind of inevitable that it was going to take place just based on the conditions of the 1940s and the 1950s and after the World War II. That's sort of something big was coming, and I'm wondering what your assessment of that is. Was it necessary that we get the radicalism of the New Left and the student protests and all of these things that come about, or what was it sort of an outgrowth of things or a reaction against things that were coming prior, or something else kind of hit the water and blew up.
Yeah, I really love Chris's book. And in fact, his book has been mentioned in one of the prominent reviews of Stumbling Toward Utopia on the question of, of the 64, civil rights and 68 voting rights. And I think it's very important in that context to really absorb Chris's narrative and to apply it. I spent a lot of time on the Great Society, and I don't want to sidestep, but I want to sort of, if I may, deepen and then evoke, Tom, the point that you raised. Well, I was born in 1964, the last year of the baby boom generation, and I was very interested in all of the early speeches and writings of all the promises and the rhetoric of what the Great Society was going to achieve. And of course, I was particularly interested in the kickoff speech of the Great Society by President Lyndon Johnson at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1964. And it is breathtaking and gargantuan and colossal, the number of promises that he makes for and promises for the Great Society. He says the Great Society is going to solve poverty. It's going to solve the inner city problems. It's going to be involved in education and solve those problems. It's going to solve the family problems. It goes on and on. One promise after the other. It's a series of what I would call utopian dreams. And I don't mind saying that not eventually, like 10 years later, but rapidly, people of goodwill, left and right, knew that the rhetoric and the promises of Lyndon Johnson did not meet the reality. I'll give you one example. In 1965, this is just a little more than a year after the Great Society is launched, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had a felicity for finding data and trends in otherwise obscure numbers found, and this is really the impact of the radicalization of the 60s. In 1965, he found that 25% of all Black Americans were born out of wedlock, and he called it a crisis. That number today is over 70%. Among Hispanic Americans, that number is well over 50%. And among native-born white Americans, that's about 33%. The majority of babies who are born to women ages 30 years of age and under are born out of wedlock. The Great Society failed. The Great Society, with all the other progressive utopian dreams, made all the promises, but the nightmare reality is the reality. And by the way, we should not be shocked or surprised, because conservatives know that human nature is a constant, and that a gargantuan, largely involved administrative state is ultimately not going to change human nature. It's going to social engineer and very often make challenges even worse. And by the way, you can apply this to the law and legal area where the progressives have been involved, higher education, secondary, primary education. As I say, the progressives have a lot to answer for, but none more so than the sexual revolution. We have the lowest fertility rates in American history. We have the lowest marriage rates in American history. And ultimately, the 60s is about a frontal assault on the natural nuclear family and on faith and religion in the public square.
So can you talk more about you started by talking a little bit about the baby boomers. Can you talk more about the 60s and how it shaped the baby boomer generation, but also how that influenced subsequent generations, so the children of the baby boomers and their children? Because there's a lot of generational angst among millennials and Gen Z today and about the boomers. And a lot of the blame directed at them seems to be rooted in this attitude of this abdication of their obligations toward posterity, maybe rooted in kind of that individualistic attitude. So do you think that's a fair assessment of how the 60s, disrupted that dynamic between the older and younger generations and this sense of debt to each other?
Absolutely. In fact, I think you can say empirically, I think it's important to say, as I say in Stumbling Toward Utopia, that anecdotes are not statistics. You can look at data in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, as we entered the 21st century, on all the things you're asking about, Marlo, and you can definitively make important conclusions. To your very central point, I think this is really foundational. In 1960, this is only 1960, 73% of all young Americans between birth and 18 were living in an intact home with a married mother and father. 73%. By 1980, that number is around 41 or 42%, and by 2015, well under that. And you have to conclude that where this all begins is precisely in the dreams of the utopians. That somehow we could find a new paradigm to replace mothers and fathers. And of course, the abortion culture. The progressives started advocating and pushing for abortion long before Roe versus Wade. It took them a long time. But now here we are in 2024, and we've had over 65 million abortions. And then to the first part of your question, the answer is absolutely yes. Look at the popular culture of the 60s, using beautiful harmony and beautiful melody, for instance, John Lennon's great song, Imagine. I speak about entertainment and popular culture at length in the book. Think about Imagine. What is he imagining? He's celebrating nihilism. He's celebrating nothingness. He's holding up moral relativism ultimately as the best cultural good for the people who are listening to his music. I mean, you really can go on and on. This was the age of Aquarius. This was the Woodstock generation. Smack, acid, people rolling around in the mud. And we have to remember that in real time, this was held up as the new cultural ideal for the United States of America. In other words, I think what we can conclude is that the 60s didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't a natural evolution. It was a group of powerful, influential people, progressive to the core, very skeptical, cynical people who decided that we needed a new America, and they were going to offer a series of achievable goals and ideas and policies, both in culture and then in public policy, that would get them ultimately to their new ideal. And by the way, that is precisely what happened. And the really great news, and I think it's great news, is that we are now leaving that period of time, and there's people of goodwill who want something better and different.
Well, Tim, you've given a sort of a grim picture, so to speak, and that's not a criticism of you, but that's just a testament to what's gone wrong, kind of like what we were discussing at the very beginning. So I wonder how you end the book in terms of a prognosis for the future, and if anything, what you might offer as a way forward.
Well, actually, I am an inveterate optimist, and the last third of the book, as you know, is just that, because I believe that restoration, renewal, and regeneration is possible in a great constitutional republic. And we have actually, as a country, been terribly polarized previously. In the American Revolutionary period, 2/3 of all Americans were either for the British or indifferent. Not to mention the Civil War, where we lost 700,000 Americans and brothers and cousins shooting each other at point blank range, in peach orchards. We've had presidents resign, Vietnam, Watergate. We have been terribly polarized and disunited in the past. But what I say in Stumbling Toward Utopia, and I feel it very strongly, is that the best days are ahead for the United States. I do believe restoration and regeneration is possible. And I'll tell you, I think we're seeing it already. In the early 90s, less than 80,000 Americans were homeschooled. That number now is over 4 million. School choice is booming. Charter schools are booming. We're having a debate rooted in the 60s over the trans issues. And yet people of both political parties, left and right, when they are asked, they say they don't want boys in girls' sports and they don't want men in women's sports. There was that moment at the Olympics where a woman was boxed in the face. And of a sudden, it was no longer just an academic argument, it was real. And I could go on and on. I think there are all kinds of seedlings in culture that have been planted and that are now germinating. And I think with very good reason, we're going to see a lot more of it. Of a sudden, we have great movies. There is good music being composed and produced. Great television. And so I think in law, legal, public policy, in culture, the big issue is our spiritual crisis. That to me is the biggest issue facing the country. But we're not like Germany, Italy, France, etc. There are still millions of very serious believers in this country who want to apply the faith and spiritual aspects of their life in the public square. So, Tom and Marlo, I actually think with good reason, and I say this in Stumbling Toward Utopia, I think there's a very good way forward for the United States. It's going to take a while. Cultural change, even for the betterment, is incremental, but good days are ahead. And I hope people will read Stumbling Toward Utopia, look at where the radicalism came from, how it applies to the time we're in, and if I may say, what we can do about it. And I think there's a lot we can do and will do. And I think beginning with ISI and others who believe strongly in the first principles and the permanence of ideas that are good ideas.
Well, Tim, I hope you're right about that, and I too recommend the book. And you've been a great friend to ISI and a great writer, so I recommend it to our listeners and watchers. Thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us about the book. So we'll find it and put it in our show notes so people can order it and read it. But what other of your work would you recommend to our listeners?
You're very kind. This is my fourth book. My memoir was Man in the Middle, which is a distillation of faith and public life during the Bush years. I think it's very relevant, timely, topical to the time we're in. American Restoration was the second book. The third, as you know, was Toward a More Perfect Union, which makes the strong case for cultural and historic literacy, and now Stumbling Toward Utopia on the 60s, 70s, and what it means for us today. So I would love for people to read all four or any of the four, and I'm just so grateful that you asked.
Thanks again. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.